My son and his wife scammed me and stole my house. So I was living in my car until my rich sister found me and gave me a house along with 200Ks to start over. Days later my son was at my door with flowers, but what I had planned made him wished he would never come back. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. My name is Carol Perkins. For 40 years I was an administrative assistant at the local university, a keeper of records, a quiet, steady presence in a world of academic chaos. I believed in the simple, honest ledger of life. You work hard, you love your family, and you build a home. This is the story of how my own son and his wife cooked the books, stole my life's greatest asset, and how I, with the help of my sister, orchestrated a final, devastating audit of their souls. Now let me tell you my story. The meeting that cost me everything began, as most betrayals do, with a performance of love. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of soft, hazy day in Charlotte, where the sun filters through the pine trees and makes you believe that all is right with the world. My son Terrence and his wife Chantel were sitting at my small, well-worn kitchen table, the very table where I had helped him with his homework and listened to his childhood dreams. They had come bearing a warm smile, a box of my favorite pastries, and a thick, intimidating stack of official-looking papers. At 66, my life was a quiet, ordered thing. I was a widow, retired from my long career at the university, and my greatest treasure was the small brick house around us. It was more than a house, it was the physical manifestation of my life with my late husband Robert. Every brick, every floorboard was saturated with the memories of our 40 years together. It was paid off, a testament to a lifetime of careful saving and quiet, unglamorous work. It was my fortress, my sanctuary, my one unshakable piece of the world. My love for my son Terrence was the central guiding principle of my life. He was my only child, a man in his late 30s with a smooth, easy charm and a talent for painting beautiful pictures with his words. He was a salesman for a solar panel company, a job that seemed to involve more talk of future success than actual present-day commissions. But I believed in him, with the fierce, often blind faith that only a mother can possess. His wife, Chantal, was another matter. She was a woman who wore her ambition like a second skin. She had no job, but she referred to herself, with a kind of breathtaking arrogance, as a brand ambassador, which seemed to involve taking endless photographs of herself in expensive outfits that I knew they couldn't afford. She was beautiful, sharp, and had a smile that was as bright and as cold as a diamond. She looked at my modest, comfortable home not with affection but with the cool, appraising eye of a developer. She saw its potential, not as a place of love, but as a source of capital. That afternoon they laid out their plan with a practiced, persuasive charm. "Mom," Terrence began, his voice a river of smooth, filial concern. "Chantal and I have been worried about you. You're all alone here. And this house, it's your biggest asset. We've been talking to a financial advisor, and he said that in today's world, with all these predatory lenders and reverse mortgage scams, you're a target. You're vulnerable." Chantal nodded, her face a mask of grave, serious concern. "We want to protect you, Carol," she said, her use of my first name a subtle, almost imperceptible power move. "We want to secure your legacy. We've had a lawyer draw up some papers. It's a simple protective family trust. It just puts the house in the family's name, with you having lifetime rights to live here, of course. It protects the asset from outsiders. It keeps it safe for you." It sounded so sensible, so loving. They were worried about me. They wanted to protect me. They were being responsible, forward-thinking children. I, a woman who had spent her life organizing paperwork for university deans, was suddenly made to feel like a naive, helpless child, a woman who couldn't possibly navigate the treacherous waters of the modern financial world without the help of her savvy, sophisticated son. I looked at Terrence, at his earnest, concerned face, and my heart swelled with a foolish, maternal pride. He was a good boy, a good son. He was looking out for his old mother. I trusted him. Of course I trusted him. He was my son. And so, with a hand that was only slightly trembling, I signed where he pointed, my signature a neat, looping testament to a lifetime of trust. I signed away my home, my security, my entire world, and I did it with a smile on my face, believing I was securing my future. The first sign that my future was not in fact secure arrived 3 weeks later. It was a crisp, white envelope taped to my front door, its official-looking window displaying my name and address in a cold, impersonal font. It looked like a tax notice, or perhaps a piece of junk mail from a real estate agent. I took it inside, slit it open with a kitchen knife, and my world fell apart. It was a formal legal notice of eviction. It stated, in the dense, unforgiving language of the law, that the property at 124 Willow Creek Lane had been legally sold 2 weeks prior. It informed me that I, the current occupant, was now considered a tenant at sufferance, and that I had 72 hours to vacate the premises before the new owners would begin formal eviction proceedings with the sheriff's department. I read the letter once, twice, a third time, my mind refusing to process the words on the page. It was a mistake. A terrible bureaucratic mix-up. This was my house. It was paid for. It was in a trust. I immediately grabbed the phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial the numbers, and I called Terrence. He answered on the second ring, his voice the same, smooth, reassuring baritone. Mom, what's up? Everything okay? I could barely speak. My own voice a choked, panicked whisper. Terrence? I stammered. I got a letter. It says the house has been sold. It says I have to be out in 3 days. It's a mistake, right? The trust, the papers we signed. You have to call the lawyer. The silence on the other end of the line was not the silence of a man who was shocked or confused. It was the brief, almost imperceptible silence of a man who was quickly, expertly crafting a lie. When he finally spoke, his voice was a symphony of performative outrage and filial concern. What? He exclaimed. His voice a perfect imitation of a man who has just received the most shocking news of his life. Sold? That's impossible. That shady lawyer. He must have messed up the paperwork. A bureaucratic mix-up, that's all it is. Don't you worry about a thing, Mom. Not a thing. I'm going to get on the phone with him right now. I'm going to go down to his office and I am going to raise holy hell. I will fix this. I promise you. Just sit tight. Don't do anything. I will handle it. His words were a balm to my raw, panicked soul. Of course. A mistake. A shady lawyer. It all made sense. Terrence was on it. He would fix it. He was a good son. I spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended, anxious animation, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the news that the terrible, impossible mistake had been rectified. But the phone did not ring. And as the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across my living room, a new, even more terrible feeling began to creep into my heart. It was the cold, sickening suspicion that the only shady lawyer in this whole sordid affair was my own beloved son. The next 72 hours were a slow, agonizing descent into a special kind of hell. My calls to Terrence now went straight to voicemail. His smooth, reassuring voice, which had been my lifeline just the day before, was now a pre-recorded mocking echo of his betrayal. I left a dozen frantic, pleading messages, each one more desperate than the last. Terrence, please call me. The new owners, they sent someone by to take pictures. Please, son. I'm so scared. But there was no reply. The silence from his end was no longer a mystery. It was a confession. He was not fixing the problem. He was the problem. He had not been the victim of a shady lawyer. He had been the architect of my ruin. The papers I had signed, the ones he had so lovingly described as a protective family trust, had been a quitclaim deed, a legal document that had transferred the ownership of my home, my life's greatest asset, directly to him for the grand princely sum of $1. He had then, I now realized with a sickening, gut-wrenching clarity, immediately sold it to a developer, cashed the check and disappeared, leaving his own mother to be thrown out onto the street. The final brutal act of this tragedy occurred on a Friday morning. I had not slept. I had not eaten. I had simply sat in my favorite armchair, the one Robert had always loved, and waited for the end. It arrived in the form of a polite but firm knock on the door. It was a sheriff's deputy, a young man with a kind, sad face who clearly hated this part of his job. Ma'am, he said, his voice gentle but resolute. I'm so sorry, but the eviction order is final. You have to leave. I looked past him, to the sidewalk in front of my house. A sleek black sedan was parked at the curb. A man in an expensive suit was leaning against it, talking on his phone, a look of bored professional impatience on his face. He was the new owner, or more accurately, the representative of the development company that now owned my life. The deputy was kind. He allowed me a few minutes to gather a few precious belongings. I moved through my own home like a ghost, a tourist in the museum of my own former life. I packed a small, worn suitcase with a few changes of clothes, my Bible and the small framed photograph of Robert and me on our wedding day. Every object I touched was a fresh source of pain, a reminder of the life that had been stolen from me. The deputy escorted me out of my own front door, his hand a gentle apologetic presence on my elbow. As I stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, I saw a large flatbed truck pull up to the curb. On its back was a bulldozer. They were not just evicting me, they were erasing me. They were going to tear down my home, my fortress, my sanctuary, and replace it with a row of soulless identical condominiums. I stood on the sidewalk, the suitcase a heavy pathetic weight in my hand, and I watched as the man in the suit directed the bulldozer towards my front porch. I looked at the rosebushes Robert had so lovingly planted at the big oak tree in the front yard where we had hung a swing for Terence when he was a boy. And I felt a grief so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made it impossible to breathe. The full monstrous weight of my son's betrayal finally crashed down on me. He had not just stolen my house, he had stolen my past, he had stolen my memories. He had taken the sacred beautiful tapestry of my life with his father, and he had sold it for scrap. The deputy, his kind face full of a pity I could not bear to see, asked me if there was anyone I could call, anywhere I could go. And in that moment, the full horrifying extent of my new reality became clear. I had a sister, a wealthy, successful sister who would have helped me in a heartbeat. But my shame, the deep, burning and utterly profound shame of what my own son had done to me, was a wall I could not climb. I could not bear for her to see me like this, a homeless, pathetic old woman, a victim of my own foolish maternal love. And so I lied. "I'll be fine," I whispered, my voice a dry, cracking thing. "I have a friend I can stay with." I got into my old, reliable car, the one possession they had not been able to take from me, and I drove away, not looking back, the sound of the bulldozer's engine a roaring final and brutal, a final, brutal and utterly final goodbye to the only home I had ever known. The first night I slept in my car in the parking lot of an all-night grocery store. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, used my coat as a blanket and tried to pretend that I was just resting my eyes on a long road trip. But the cold, hard reality of my situation was a constant, nagging presence. The unfamiliar sounds of the city at night, the glare of the parking lot lights, the hard, unyielding pressure of the steering wheel against my side. It was all a testament to my new, terrifying reality. I was homeless. The word itself was a source of profound, burning shame. I, Carol Perkins, a woman who had worked her entire life, who had always paid her bills on time, who had prided herself on her independence and her self-sufficiency, was a homeless person. I had become one of the invisible, unfortunate souls I had so often seen on the streets of Charlotte, the people I had always pitied, but had never ever imagined I would become. The next few days were a blur of fear, humiliation and a constant, grinding struggle for survival. I learned the rhythm of this new, underground life. I would sleep in my car in different anonymous parking lots, hospitals, 24-hour gyms, industrial parks, never staying in one place for more than a night, terrified of attracting the attention of the police, or worse, of someone who might see my vulnerability as an opportunity. I would wash up in the cold, impersonal bathrooms of gas stations and fast food restaurants. My reflection in the grimy mirrors a constant, shocking reminder of how far I had fallen. I looked old. The stress and the fear had etched new, deep lines into my face, and my eyes, which had always been my best feature, were now dull and haunted. I lived on a diet of cheap coffee, day-old pastries, and the kindness of strangers. I learned that the morning shift at a donut shop will often give you the unsold items from the day before for free if you ask nicely. I learned that a public library is a warm, safe and free place to spend a cold, rainy afternoon. It was a life of constant low-grade anxiety, of 1,000 small daily humiliations. Every time a police car would cruise past my parked car at night, my heart would leap into my throat. Every time I had to ask for a key to a gas station bathroom, I felt a fresh wave of shame. I was a respectable retired university administrator and I was living the life of a vagrant. My greatest fear was not the cold, or the hunger or the discomfort. It was the shame, the deep, burning and utterly profound shame of what my own son had done to me. It was a wall that I could not climb, a prison that was more confining than my small, cramped car. It was the reason I could not call my sister, Maxine, my brilliant, successful and powerful younger sister. She was the founder and owner of a wildly successful chain of upscale Southern cuisine restaurants, a self-made woman who had built an empire from a single family recipe. She was everything I was not. Confident, worldly and utterly completely in control of her own life. She would have been horrified by my situation, and she would have helped me in a heartbeat. but I could not bear the thought of her seeing me like this. I could not bear the pity in her eye. I could not bear to be the object of her charity, the poor, pathetic older sister who had been so foolish, so naive, as to be swindled out of her own home by her own monstrous son. And so I remained silent. I chose the cold, hard, and humiliating reality of homelessness over the warm, loving, and to my mind, even more humiliating embrace of my own sister's help. Weeks turned into a month. My small reserve of cash was dwindling. My car, my one last sanctuary, was beginning to make a strange, rattling noise. The nights were getting colder. The hope that had sustained me in the first few days, the irrational belief that this was all just a temporary, terrible nightmare from which I would soon awaken, was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying despair. I was beginning to realize that this was not a temporary situation. This was my life now. I was a 66-year-old woman, living in my car, and I was slowly, inexorably running out of time, out of money, and out of hope. My world had shrunk to the size of a 4-door sedan, and the walls were closing in. My sister Maxine was a force of nature. While I had inherited our mother's quiet, gentle spirit, Maxine had inherited our father's fierce, unshakable will. She was a woman who did not just face obstacles, she obliterated them, and her greatest, most unshakable loyalty was to her family, and especially to me, her quiet, older sister, whom she had always, in her own bossy, loving way, tried to protect. Our weekly phone calls were a sacred ritual, a constant, reassuring thread in the fabric of our separate lives. So when I suddenly, inexplicably went silent, her internal alarm bells, which were already finely tuned to the frequency of my well-being, began to scream. At first she was just annoyed. I was probably just busy, she told herself, but after a week of her calls going straight to my unanswered voicemail, her annoyance turned to a cold, creeping worry. She called my neighbors who hadn't seen me. She called my old colleagues at the university who had no idea where I was. Her worry began to curdle into a full-blown, frantic panic. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She did what she always did when faced with a problem. She took direct, decisive action. She got in her car, a sleek, powerful machine that was a testament to her own hard-won success, and she drove the 2 hours from her home in Raleigh to my small, quiet street in Charlotte. The scene that greeted her was not just a shock, it was a desecration. My house, the house where we had spent 1,000 happy holidays, the house that was a living museum of our shared family history, was gone. In its place was a raw, muddy construction site, a gaping, ugly wound in the heart of the familiar tree-lined street. A large, garish sign pounded into the center of what had once been my front lawn announced the coming of the Willows at Creekwood, a new luxury condominium development. Maxine stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs, and she stared at the wreckage of my life. She was a woman who was not easily shaken, but in that moment she felt a fear so profound, so absolute, that it almost brought her to her knees. Her sister was not just missing, her entire world had been erased. Maxine's grief, however, quickly hardened into a cold, strategic fury. She was not a woman who wept. She was a woman who acted. She immediately went to the local police precinct and filed a missing persons report. The desk sergeant, a weary, overworked man, was initially dismissive. An elderly woman who hasn't answered her phone for a few weeks? She was probably on vacation, he suggested. That was when he learned that he was not dealing with a hysterical, overwrought relative. He was dealing with Maxine Sinclair, a woman whose name carried a significant amount of weight in the state of North Carolina, a woman who had the personal cell phone numbers of state senators and city council members. Within the hour, a detective was assigned to the case. Maxine, using her own considerable resources, hired a private investigator as well. She was not going to sit by and wait for the slow, grinding wheels of bureaucracy to turn. She was going to launch her own parallel investigation. The search began. They checked my bank records, which showed my last pathetic withdrawal from an ATM a week ago. They checked my phone records, which showed a series of frantic, unanswered calls to my son Terrence. And then a small but crucial break. A persistent, sharp-eyed police officer, canvassing the city's hospital parking lots, a common hiding place for the city's homeless population, spotted my old, beat-up car tucked away in a far corner of the lot. He ran the plates. It was a match. Maxine received the call at 2 o'clock in the morning. She was in her hotel room, surrounded by maps and legal documents. A one-woman command center in the war to find her sister. She threw on her coat, got in her car, and drove, her heart a mixture of soaring hope and terrifying dread. She found me in the back of my car, huddled under my thin coat, my face pale and gaunt in the cold, artificial glow of the parking lot lights. I was asleep, but it was the fitful, exhausted sleep of a hunted animal, not the peaceful, restorative sleep of a human being. She stood there for a long moment, looking through the car window at the pathetic, heartbreaking sight of her older sister, a proud, dignified woman who had been reduced to this, a homeless, terrified refugee in her own city. And in that moment, her heart, which had been a tight, anxious knot of fear, broke. But as the tears of grief and pity began to well up in her eyes, a new, more powerful emotion rose up to meet them. It was rage, a pure, incandescent, and utterly focused rage, a rage directed at the one person she knew, with an unshakable gut-level certainty was responsible for this horror. My son, her nephew, Terence. She did not wake me. She simply stood guard by my car, a silent, furious sentinel, until the first gray light of dawn broke over the city. And as she waited, she was not just planning my rescue, she was planning his destruction. The reunion was a blur of tears, of shame, of a love so fierce and so unconditional that it was a physical pain. Maxine did not berate me for my pride, for my foolish, stubborn refusal to call her. She simply held me, her strong arms a fortress against the cold, cruel world that had so thoroughly broken me. She took me from the cold, cramped prison of my car and drove me to her home, a sprawling, beautiful estate on the outskirts of Raleigh that was the physical embodiment of her success. It was a world of light, of warmth, of comfort, a world so far removed from the gas stations and the parking lots of my recent life that it felt like a dream. She led me to a private guest house, a beautiful self-contained cottage on her property, and she told me it was mine, for as long as I needed it. She ran me a hot bath. She gave me a soft, clean robe to wear. She made me a meal, a real hot meal, the first I had had in over a month. And as I sat in her warm, beautiful kitchen, the food and the safety and the love beginning to thaw the frozen, numb core of my soul, I told her everything, the whole, ugly, sordid story, the trust, the eviction, the bulldozer, and the final, soul-crushing betrayal of my own son. As I spoke, I watched a transformation occur in my sister's face. The initial heartbreaking pity in her eyes was slowly replaced by a look of such cold, strategic fury that it was almost terrifying. Her grief, which had been a raw, open wound, was now being forged into a weapon. When I was finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to her desk, and opened her checkbook. "First things first," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "We are going to restore your dignity, and your bank account." She wrote a check, her pen strokes sharp and angry, and slid it across the table to me. I looked down at the number. $200,000. "Alone?" I whispered, my voice thick with a shame I could not shake. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice a fierce, protective command. "It is a gift. It is an investment. It is the seed money for the new and infinitely better life you are about to build. And it is the war chest for the battle we are about to wage." She then picked up her phone. "And now," she said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face, "we are going to hire the most ruthless, most expensive, and most effective lawyer in the state of North Carolina." The rescue was over. The retribution was about to begin. The news of my miraculous resurrection traveled through the family grapevine with the speed of a wildfire. The story, as it was told, was a beautiful, heartwarming tale of sisterly love and redemption. Poor, homeless Carol, the story went, had been found by her rich, generous sister Maxine, and had been swept away to a life of unimaginable luxury. The narrative was, of course, entirely true. But the subtext, the part of the story that was of most interest to my son and his wife, was the part about the money. My new life, my new home, my new and very substantial bank account. For Terence and Chantel, this was not a story of my salvation. It was a story of their opportunity. They had, as I had suspected, and as Maxine's private investigator had quickly confirmed, already squandered the majority of the money from the fraudulent sale of my house. The six-figure sum that had seemed like a king's ransom had been burned through in a matter of weeks. A frantic, pathetic orgy of luxury car leases, designer clothes, and expensive, ostentatious dinners. They were not investors, they were consumers, and their insatiable appetite for the trappings of wealth had already left them on the brink of financial ruin once again. My newfound fortune, therefore, was not a source of relief for them, a sign that their poor homeless mother was now safe and cared for. It was a fresh scent of blood in the water. It was a new, untapped resource, a second chance to get their hands on the kind of money they so desperately craved. Their greed, which had been temporarily sated by the sale of my home, was instantly and ferociously reignited. They saw me not as a victim they had wronged, but as a newly refilled piggy bank, a lottery winner whose jackpot they were entitled to share. The phone call, when it came, was a masterpiece of manipulative self-serving theater. It was Terrence, his voice a thick convincing symphony of tearful, choked relief. "Mom," he sobbed, his performance so flawless it was almost believable. "Oh my God, Mom, is that really you? I've been so worried. I've been looking for you everywhere. I thought something terrible had happened to you." I sat in the sun-drenched living room of my new beautiful guest house, the phone pressed to my ear, and I listened to his lies. Beside me on the sofa sat Maxine, a silent, watchful presence, her eyes a mixture of cold fury and grim satisfaction. We had been expecting this call. We had, in fact, been counting on it. "Where have you been, Mom?" he continued, his voice breaking with a perfectly feigned anguish. "I went to the house and it was gone. I've been calling the police. I've been calling hospitals. I've been out of my mind with worry." "I'm with Maxine," I said, my own voice a quiet neutral statement of fact. "Maxine?" he said, a new more complicated note entering his voice. A note of surprise, and I suspected, of calculation. "Oh, well, that's great. I'm so glad you're safe." And then he launched into the second act of his performance, the story of his own tragic victimhood. "Mom, you have to believe me," he said, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial whisper. "That lawyer, he scammed us. Both of us. The papers we signed, they weren't what he said they were. He tricked me, Mom. He tricked us. I would never have let anything happen to your house. You have to know that. I've been trying to fix it, to get it back. But he disappeared. He took the money and he ran." It was a brilliant, if utterly shameless lie. He had created a phantom villain, a convenient invisible scapegoat upon whom he could blame his own monstrous betrayal. He was not the perpetrator. He was a fellow victim, a loving, naive son who had been duped by a sophisticated con artist. And now he was coming to me, his mother, for comfort, for forgiveness, for a chance to rebuild their shattered and now conveniently profitable relationship. The trap was being set, and my son, blinded by his own insatiable greed, was about to walk right into it. The prodigal son arrived at the gates of my sister's estate 3 days later. He did not come in his usual slightly beat-up sedan. He came in a rented top-of-the-line luxury car, a pathetic, transparent attempt to project an image of a success that was as fraudulent as his own manufactured grief. He was holding a ridiculously oversized bouquet of white lilies, the traditional flower of funerals, a subtle, and I'm sure entirely unconscious, admission of the death of his own conscience. He was dressed in an expensive suit that was clearly new, his face a carefully constructed mask of tearful, remorseful anguish. It was a performance of such breathtaking, shameless audacity that a small, cold part of me was almost impressed. He had always been a good talker, a talented salesman, and now, he was preparing to make the biggest, most important sale of his life. The sale of his own counterfeit soul. I met him on the grand sweeping veranda of Maxine's main house, a neutral ground we had chosen for this first, delicate stage of our counter-offensive. Maxine was not present. Her role for now was to be the invisible, silent power behind the throne. This was my scene to play, and I had been well coached. The moment he saw me, his face crumpled into a mask of pure theatrical relief. "Mom," he cried, his voice breaking with a perfectly feigned emotion as he rushed towards me. The lilies held out like a peace offering. "Oh, Mom, I thought I'd never see you again." He tried to hug me, but I took a small, almost imperceptible step back, a gesture that was both a rejection and a test. He stopped, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. I had not followed the script. I was supposed to fall into his arms, weeping with a mother's foolish, unconditional forgiveness. Instead, I just looked at him, my expression a carefully constructed mixture of fragility and fear. "Terrence," I whispered, my voice a weak, trembling thing. I was so scared. It was the first line of my own counter-performance, and it was a brilliant one. It immediately cast me in the role he wanted me to play, the weak, traumatized victim. His face immediately softened with a look of profound, condescending sympathy. He was back in control. "I know, Mom. I know," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "It's all my fault. I should have been more careful. I should have protected you. That lawyer, he was so convincing. He fooled me completely. I've been trying to track him down to get your house back, but he's a ghost. He vanished. He then launched into a long, rambling and entirely fictional account of his desperate, tireless search for me, a story filled with sleepless nights, frantic phone calls, and a deep, abiding and utterly fraudulent concern for my well-being. I listened, my face a mask of wide-eyed, credulous belief. I allowed tears to well up in my eyes, a single perfect and entirely fake tear to trace a path down my cheek. When he was finally finished, his performance of filial devotion complete, I played my next card. "I forgive you, Terence," I whispered, my voice thick with a choked, counterfeit emotion. "I know you would never do anything to hurt me. You're my son, my good son." The look of relief on his face was so profound, so absolute, that it was almost comical. He had done it. He had won me over. The old, foolish and endlessly forgiving mother was back. The piggy bank was open for business once again. I invited him into my new life, into the beautiful sun-drenched guest house that was now my home. I showed him the elegant furnishings, the fully stocked kitchen, the beautiful private garden. I watched as his eyes, which had been so full of fake tears just moments before, now glittered with a very real and very ugly greed. He was not seeing a home, he was seeing a price tag. And then, as we sat in my new comfortable living room, I set the final, irresistible bait. I told him about the $200,000 my sister had given me, the fresh start money that was now sitting in my new private bank account. "It's a blessing, of course," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of a confused, overwhelmed old woman. "But it's so much responsibility. I don't know what to do with it. After what happened with that lawyer, I'm so scared of being taken advantage of again." I looked at him, my eyes wide with a manufactured, pathetic helplessness. "I need a smart man like you to help me, Terence," I said, my voice a pleading whisper. "I need you to help me manage it, to invest it, to make sure I'm never vulnerable again." The look on his face was a thing of monstrous, beautiful and utterly predictable greed. His eyes, which had been so full of fake sympathy, now held the cold, hard glint of a predator who has just seen a wounded, fat and exceptionally stupid gazelle wander into his path. "Of course, Mom," he said, his voice a low, soothing purr of pure, unadulterated avarice. "Of course I'll help you. We'll keep it safe. We'll make it grow. We'll do it all, as a family." The trap had been baited, and my son, my greedy, foolish and utterly predictable son, had just taken it, hook, line and sinker. The final act of our play was scheduled for a week later. The setting was the hushed, opulent office of a man who was introduced to Terence and Chantal as my new lawyer. His name was Mr. Davenport, and he was in reality Maxine's most ruthless and effective corporate attorney, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers and who was now, for a very handsome fee, applying his considerable talents to the hostile takeover of my son's fraudulent life. Terence and Chantal arrived at the meeting dressed for a coronation. He was in a new, ridiculously expensive suit, a clear, premature investment of my own future money. She was a vision in designer clothes, her face a mask of triumphant, barely concealed greed. They looked like two vultures who had just been invited to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Mr. Davenport was a masterpiece of professional, understated competence. He was calm, polite, and utterly reassuring. He explained, in the dry, soothing language of the law, that he had drawn up the necessary documents to establish a new Perkins family trust. This trust, he explained, would be the legal vehicle for managing my newfound assets, and as per my wishes, it would grant my son Terence Perkins full and irrevocable power of attorney, giving him the legal authority to manage, invest, and disperse the funds as he saw fit. As he spoke, I watched my son's face. He was trying to maintain a facade of solemn, responsible concern, but he could not conceal the greedy, triumphant glint in his eyes. He was a child who had just been handed the keys to the candy store. Chantal was less subtle. A small, smug and utterly reptilian smile was playing on her lips. She was already, I was sure, mentally redecorating her new imaginary mansion in River Oaks. Mr. Davenport then produced the documents, a thick, intimidating stack of papers bound in a handsome blue legal folder. "Now," he said, his voice a calm, professional drone, "this is a standard, boilerplate trust agreement. I've highlighted the relevant sections for you. The first section establishes the trust. The second names Mrs. Perkins as the primary beneficiary, and the third, here on page 12, grants Mr. Perkins the full power of attorney we just discussed. If you'll just sign and initial on all the indicated pages, we can have this filed with the court by the end of the day." He pushed the stack of papers across the vast, polished mahogany desk towards them, and then, the moment of truth. the moment upon which our entire elaborate plan depended. Would they read the fine print, or would their own blinding, all-consuming greed make them reckless? I held my breath, but I needn't have worried. They were so eager, so desperate to get their hands on my money, that the thought of performing their due diligence never even crossed their minds. Terence picked up the pen with a flourish. A man who was about to sign the treaty that would make him a king. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning only for the small yellow "Sign Here" tabs. He did not read a single word. He just signed, his signature a bold, arrogant scrawl, a testament to his own monumental stupidity. Chantal, as his co-trustee, did the same. Page after page, they signed, they initialed, they bound themselves, legally and irrevocably, to a contract they had not bothered to read. It was the most beautiful, most satisfying, and most expensive act of arrogance I had ever witnessed. When they were finished, they pushed the stack of papers back across the desk, their faces wreathed in triumphant, self-satisfied smiles. They had done it. They had secured the bag. They were rich. Mr. Davenport gathered the papers, his own face a mask of calm, professional neutrality. "Excellent," he said. "My office will handle the rest. It was a pleasure meeting you both." They stood up, shook his hand, and practically danced out of the office, their minds already a million miles away, spending my money in 1,000 different glorious ways. They were so blinded by their victory that they didn't even bother to say goodbye to me. I was, once again, an afterthought, a means to an end. After they had gone, a profound and deeply satisfying silence settled over the office. Mr. Davenport, the calm, professional lawyer, allowed a slow, dangerous smile to spread across his face. He looked at me, and then at Maxine, who had been a silent, watchful presence in the corner of the room throughout the entire meeting. "Well?" he said, his voice a low, appreciative rumble. "That was without a doubt the easiest hostile takeover I have ever orchestrated." He then opened the thick blue folder, and began to explain the true, beautiful, and utterly devastating nature of the trap they had just so eagerly, and so stupidly sprung. "The first 20 pages, he explained, are exactly what I said they were, a standard boilerplate trust agreement. It's all perfectly legal, and utterly meaningless, as we have no intention of ever actually funding this trust." He then flipped to the back of the document, to a separate smaller section of pages that had been seamlessly integrated into the main body of the contract. "This, however," he said, his smile widening, "is the interesting part. Buried deep within the dense, impenetrable forest of legal jargon was a separate and entirely independent legal document. It was a full, notarized, and legally binding confession. It detailed in excruciating and legally precise detail the entire sordid story of the original real estate fraud. It described the fraudulent family trust, the quitclaim deed, the sale of my home, and the subsequent abandonment. And it contained a full, unqualified admission of guilt, signed and initialed on every single page by both Terence and Chantal Perkins. But that was not all. Attached to the confession was a second, even more beautiful, legal instrument. It was an irrevocable repayment agreement. It stated that, in consideration for my agreement not to press criminal charges, they, Terence and Chantal Perkins, were legally binding themselves to the full and complete repayment of the fair market value of the home they had stolen, a sum that had been independently appraised at over $400,000. The agreement included a strict, non-negotiable repayment schedule, and it granted me, Carol Perkins, the legal right to place a lien on all their current and future assets, and to garnish their wages, in the event of a single missed payment. They had not signed a document that gave them control of my future. They had signed a document that gave me complete and total control of theirs. They had walked into that office believing they were about to become rich. They had walked out having legally bound themselves to a lifetime of debt. A debt that would follow them, haunt them, and slowly, inexorably, grind their greedy, pathetic lives into dust. The trap which had been so carefully, so patiently, and so brilliantly set, had just been sprung, and the sound of its snapping shut was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The final devastating blow was delivered a week later. The timing, as orchestrated by the brilliant and theatrical Mr. Davenport, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Terence, as we had learned from Maxine's private investigator, was at a luxury car dealership, in the final stages of purchasing a ridiculously expensive sports car, a celebratory purchase he was undoubtedly planning to make with the first, large and entirely imaginary withdrawal from my investment fund. He would have been in a state of pure, arrogant bliss, the king of his own fraudulent universe, the master of a fortune he had not earned, but had so cleverly and so easily acquired. And then his phone would have rung. The caller would not have been his new friendly investment banker. It would have been a man from a collections law firm, a man whose voice would have been as cold, as hard, and as unforgiving as a tombstone. The collections attorney would have begun by introducing himself, and then with a calm, professional, and utterly devastating precision, he would have informed Terence that a legal judgment in the amount of $427,000 had been entered against him and his wife Chantel Perkins. He would have explained that based on a legally binding, notarized confession, which Terence himself had signed just 1 week prior, all their assets, their bank accounts, their leased cars, their very future earnings, had been frozen, effective immediately. He would have informed him that a lien had been placed on all their property and that a wage garnishment order was being filed with his employer on that very day. I can picture the scene with a perfect, satisfying clarity. The blood draining from Terence's handsome, confident face. The look of pure, uncomprehending shock followed by a dawning, horrified understanding. The slick, confident car salesman who had been fawning over him just moments before would have seen the look on his face and would have begun to slowly, cautiously back away. Terence would have stammered, would have protested, would have claimed it was all a mistake, but the collections attorney, a man who had heard 1,000 such protests, would have been unmoved. He would have simply and calmly referred him to the signed, notarized confession, a document to which there was no legal defense. In the space of a single 5-minute phone call, my son's entire fraudulent world would have collapsed into a black hole of his own, making the luxury car, the designer clothes, the life of imagined wealth. It would have all evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard, and inescapable reality of a lifetime of debt. He had walked into that dealership, believing he was about to buy a symbol of his new rich life. He would have walked out, a man whose entire future had just been repossessed. The final scene of this long and terrible play took place not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, but in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my sister's beautiful, sprawling garden. It was a warm, late autumn evening, the air fragrant with the scent of late-blooming roses. Maxine and I were sitting on her veranda, a pot of tea and a plate of cookies between us, watching the sun set behind the tall, dark pines that lined her property. We were not talking about Terence. We were not talking about revenge. We were talking about the future, about the new life I was about to begin, a life of peace, of security, of a quiet, hard-won dignity. And then, my new phone, the one Maxine had bought me, began to ring. The caller ID, which I had programmed with a kind of grim, final satisfaction, flashed on the screen. It was Terence. I looked at the phone, at my son's name, and I felt not a flicker of the old, maternal love, not a tremor of the old, familiar pain. I felt only a profound and deeply satisfying sense of closure. I looked at Maxine, and she gave me a small, knowing nod. I let the call go to voicemail. A moment later the phone buzzed, indicating a new message. We did not listen to it right away. We sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, sipping our tea, watching as the last fiery vestiges of the sunset faded into a soft twilight purple. Later, out of a kind of detached clinical curiosity, we played the message. The voice that filled the quiet evening air was not the smooth, confident, and charming voice of my son, the salesman. It was the raw, ugly, and unrecognizable sound of a cornered, terrified animal. It was a torrent of screamed threats, of sobbed pleas, of incoherent, hysterical rage. He was begging, he was threatening, he was crying. He was a man who had just seen the full, horrifying extent of the trap he had so eagerly and so stupidly walked into, and it was the sound of a man who knew, with a final, soul-crushing certainty, that there was no escape. I listened to the message, to the sound of my son's life imploding, and I felt nothing but a quiet, serene, and utterly final sense of peace. He had come to my door with flowers, hoping to scam me out of a second fortune. He had left, having legally bound himself to a lifetime of repaying his original crime. My revenge was not loud, it was not emotional. It was the quiet, satisfying click of a well-sprung legal trap. It was the beautiful, elegant, and utterly final signature on a contract to which he and he alone had agreed. Now, I'm curious about you who have listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had to choose between turning a blind eye and fighting for what was rightfully yours? Comment below. Thank you for watching.